Garrett Briggs had not slept in 3 days. Not really slept. Not the kind of sleep where your body lets go and your mind goes quiet and you wake up feeling like yourself again. He had been lying in the same spot on the same mattress he had shared with Nora for 22 years, staring at the same water stain on the ceiling he had been meaning to patch since the spring she first got sick. It was a small stain the size of a dinner plate, brownish at the edges where the moisture had crept outward and dried and crept again over the years. He had looked at it so many times in the past 14 months that he knew its shape the way you know the face of someone you love. Every variation, every shadow it made when the light came through the window at different angles. He knew exactly what tomorrow morning looked like. Harlow's people would arrive at 9. There would be a lawyer, probably two. There would be paperwork with his name printed on the cover in clean black type, and someone would offer him a pen with the kind of practiced hollow smile that says, "We are sorry for your loss," while their other hand is already reaching for what belonged to you. And Garrett would have to sign because there was nothing left to fight with. No money, no leverage, no miracle hiding around any corner he had not already checked twice. The garage, his father's garage. Harrison's Auto and Cycles, established 1971. The sign out front had two dead letters. The A in Auto and the second S in Cycles had burned out 3 years ago, and Garrett had not fixed them because Nora got sick around that same time. And after that, fixing a sign felt like the kind of thing you do when life still has the shape of a future. He had ordered the replacement bulbs. He had put them in a cardboard box and set the box on a shelf in the back room and told himself he would get to it. He had not gotten to it. The sign had read Harrison's Auto and Cycle for 3 years, missing two letters still legible to anyone who already knew what it said, invisible in its damage to people who paid close enough attention. He sat on the edge of the mattress and pressed his palms flat against his knees, a habit he had picked up from his father, a way of steadying the hands when the chest starts getting tight. Frank Briggs had come back from Korea with two things intact: his hands and his belief that a man who could fix something broken was never truly useless. He had built this garage on that belief. He had built it on Route 66 because Route 66 was a road that went somewhere, even when you did not know where, and a man who fixes things belongs on a road like that. Frank Briggs had been gone 11 years. Nora had been gone 14 months. And tomorrow the garage would be gone too, unless something happened that Garrett could not bring himself to imagine, because he had stopped letting himself imagine things that were not going to come true. He had learned that lesson the hard way, in a hospital waiting room, watching a doctor walk down a corridor toward him with news written in the set of his shoulders before a single word was spoken. Garrett pulled on his jeans, his flannel shirt soft from years of washing, his steel-toed boots that had been resoled twice and still held the shape of his feet, the way good boots do when you have worn them long enough. He did not know why he was getting dressed. It was nearly midnight. There was nowhere to go and nothing left to do. But sitting still felt like agreeing with what was coming. And Garrett Briggs had never been built for agreeing with things that were wrong. He went downstairs to the shop floor. The smell hit him first the way it always hit him when he came down after hours. Grease and metal and rubber and something older underneath all of that. Something that had soaked into the concrete over 50 years and could not be cleaned out no matter how many times you mopped. The accumulated presence of 10,000 engines brought back to life by his father's hands and then by his own. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of work honestly done, of problems solved and roads made possible again. And to Garrett, it smelled like home in a way that the apartment above it, for all its familiarity, had not quite managed to smell since Nora left it. He stood in the center of the shop and looked around at everything. The tools hanging on the pegboard wall, every wrench in its designated outline, every socket in its tray, organized by size from left to right the way Frank had insisted, and the way Garrett had maintained out of habit long after his father was gone to correct him. The two hydraulic lifts his father had installed in 1984, and that still worked because Garrett maintained them the same way his father had maintained everything, which was thoroughly and without shortcuts. The old radio on the shelf above the workbench, the one that only received two stations clearly but that Garrett had never replaced because it had been there since before he could remember, and replacing it seemed like a small, unnecessary erasure. The oil stains on the concrete floor that mapped 30 years of his father's work and 15 years of his own overlapping and layering into a kind of geological record of every engine that had ever bled onto this ground. He thought about how all of it would probably end up at auction within a month. The tools would go to strangers who would not know what they had touched. The lifts would be sold for scrap or reinstalled somewhere else without any memory of what they had held up. The radio would go to whoever made the highest bid, probably someone who wanted it for its vintage appearance and would set it on a shelf and never actually use it. And the concrete floor with its 50 years of oil and labor that would stay, but it would belong to whatever Grant Harlow decided to build here, which would bear no resemblance to what this place had been and would carry no memory of it. That thought sat in Garrett like a stone. He was still standing there in the center of the shop, not doing anything, just standing and looking and breathing the smell of it when he heard the sound from outside. It started at the edge of his awareness, something struggling. An engine that wanted to work but could not quite manage it anymore. Coughing and lurching and then going silent, and then the slow, heavy scrape of something large being pushed along asphalt, the irregular rhythm of something with wheels that was not rolling freely. Garrett frowned. He walked to the bay door and pulled it up, and the night air came in warm and dry, the way Arizona nights are warm and dry even when the day is cooled. He looked out at Route 66. The man pushing the motorcycle was older. Late 60s, maybe early 70s, with a gray beard that had earned every inch of itself and a riding vest layered over a heavy jacket despite the warmth. He was lean in the way that men get lean when they have been through enough, that the body strips away everything that was not load-bearing. Every line of him was deliberate. He moved with the economy of someone who had long since stopped wasting motion on things that did not matter. The motorcycle he was pushing was a Harley-Davidson, an older model, and even in the low light spilling from the open bay, Garrett could see it was in serious trouble. The engine housing had cracked probably from sustained heat, and there was oil on the tank and frame in places where oil had no business being. The front fork was sitting at an angle that explained why the man was struggling to keep the whole machine from pulling sideways on him. It was not a quick fix. It was not a tune-up or a fluid top-off or something you could patch in an hour and send a man on his way. Garrett was looking at real work, the kind that takes time and concentration in parts you may or may not have on hand. The man stopped when he saw Garrett standing in the lit doorway. They looked at each other across the distance of the lot, two men in the middle of the night regarding each other with the particular mutual assessment that happens when strangers meet in isolated places and have to decide quickly what kind of situation they are in. The man said, "I saw your sign from the highway. Figured it was worth trying." Garrett said, "We're closed." The man nodded slowly as if this were information he had already accounted for. He did not move to leave. He just stood there with both hands on the handlebars of the leaning motorcycle, holding it upright with what looked like practiced effort, breathing steadily. His expression was not desperate. It was something on the other side of desperation, the expression of a man who has made his peace with being told no and has arrived at a place of simple necessity. The situation is what it is. There is nowhere else to go. This is the only door. Garrett looked at his motorcycle again. He looked at the cracked housing and the oil residue and the fork alignment. He said, "What happened to it?" The man said, "Heat got to the engine about 40 miles east. Started throwing oil around mile 30. The fork happened 2 weeks ago. I've been nursing her along since then." "Where are you headed?" "Down California." Garrett looked at the man's face. There was something in it beyond the immediate problem of the broken machine. Something underneath the practical difficulty of a man with a motorcycle that would not run. Something that had moved past the point of panic and arrived at a different kind of urgency, quieter, and more settled, the kind that belongs to a person who has somewhere important to be and is not going to be stopped from getting there regardless of what it costs. Garrett said, "Parts alone on a job like this are going to run several hundred. Labor on top of that. You're probably looking at 1,000, maybe more, depending on what I find when I open her up." The man reached into the inside pocket of his vest and produced a worn leather wallet. He opened it and looked at what was inside for a moment, And the look on his face as he looked was not embarrassment. It was honesty, the plain acknowledgement of a fact he already knew and was simply confirming for the purposes of full disclosure. He said, "I've got $52." He paused. "I know what that means. I'm not asking you to work for free. I'm just—" He stopped, started again. I didn't know where else to stop. Garrett stood in the doorway of his father's garage on what he believed was the last night he would own it, and he looked at the man with the $52 and the broken motorcycle, and something happened in him that was not a calculation. It was not the thought that he was losing the place tomorrow anyway. So what did it matter? It was not generosity in the abstract sense, not the performance of a virtue for an audience that did not exist. What happened was much simpler and much more specific. He thought about his father. He thought about Frank Briggs standing in the same doorway and about something Frank had told him when Garrett was 12 years old and watching his father spend 2 hours on a job that was clearly not going to pay enough to be worth the time. Frank had said the measure of a shop is not the size of the jobs it takes. It's the ones it refuses to turn away. Garrett said, "Push it inside." The man's name was Dex Calloway. He said it the way men say their names in quiet places at late hours, without preamble, without the social padding that means you are hoping for a reaction. Just Dex Calloway plainly, and then he set his helmet on the workbench and looked around the shop the way people look at spaces when they understand what a space is supposed to be. Not just seeing the surfaces, but reading what they represent. His eyes moved over the pegboard and the tools and the lifts and the old radio with the unhurried attention of a man who knows what work looks like and is registering that it has been done here for a long time. He said, "Your place," Garrett said, "my father's place. Mine now for one more night." Dex looked at him, not with surprise, not with the reflexive pity that the statement might have drawn from someone else, with something more careful. The attention of a man who has heard hard things said plainly before and knows how to sit with them. What happens tomorrow? Garrett did not usually answer questions like that from strangers. There were things he had kept contained for 14 months. Things he carried in the specific compressed way that men of a certain generation and a certain disposition carry things they have decided not to burden other people with. But there was something about the hour and the emptiness of the shop and the fact that he had already in some deep way let go of what tomorrow held something that made the truth feel lighter than the alternative. He said, "Man named Grant Harlow has been buying up my debts for 2 years. Medical bills mostly. My wife was sick for a long time." He paused. "She passed 14 months ago. By then, Harlow already had enough leverage. His lawyers come in the morning at 9. Dex was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, he said, "I'm sorry about your wife." He said it the way people say it when they mean it as a statement of recognition rather than a social formality. An acknowledgement that something real had been lost and that the loss mattered. Garrett nodded and picked up a diagnostic light and began moving around the Harley, crouching low to examine the underside of the engine. "This your bike?" he asked. "No," Dex said. Garrett looked up. Dex reached into the inside pocket of his vest and produced something small. A metal canister sealed roughly the size of a large thermos, carried with the particular care that people carry, things that are irreplaceable. He held it for a moment before he spoke, and in that moment Garrett understood before the words came that what was in the canister was not a spare part or a personal effect in the ordinary sense. Dex said, "It belonged to a man named Walt Pruitt. He rode with our chapter for 40 years. He passed 6 weeks ago. Cancer. The fast kind didn't give him much time to argue with it." He looked at the canister. His daughter asked if someone would ride his ashes out to the Pacific Ocean. Walt had always talked about getting to California, said he'd never made it there in life, and he wasn't going to let dying stop him from getting there. Garrett stood up slowly. He looked at the canister in Dex's hands, and then at Dex's face, and then back at the canister. He thought about what that meant. 40 miles of broken engine, 30 miles of thrown oil, a 2-week-old fork problem nursed along through the desert, all of it in service of getting a dead man's ashes to the edge of the continent. You rode from New Mexico, Garrett said. 1,200 miles, Dex said. Walt's bike kept telling me she'd make it. I kept believing her. He almost smiled. She almost wasn't wrong. Garrett looked at the Harley again with different eyes. He looked at the cracked housing and the oil damage and the fork sitting at its wrong angle, and he thought about 1,200 miles, and a man who wanted to reach the ocean, and a friend carrying him there in a metal canister in his vest pocket, and he felt something settle in him the way a decision settles when it has already been made before you consciously arrived at it. He said, "Get yourself some coffee from the machine in the corner. It's not good coffee, but it's hot. This is going to take a while." Dex Calloway did not hover. He did not ask questions or offer running commentary or fill the silences with the kind of talk that helps no one and only serves to remind a working man that someone is watching him work. He got the coffee from the machine in the corner, and he sat on the stool near the workbench, and he watched in the way that men who have spent time in close quarters with other working men learn to watch with attention but without intrusion, reading when assistance was useful and when silence was the better contribution. Garrett started with the fork alignment. That was safety first. That was the piece that if it failed on the highway at speed would not give a man time to correct. He worked with the kind of concentration his father had modeled for him across 20 years of watching the kind that shuts out everything peripheral and reduces the world to the problem directly in front of you. It was a form of respect for the machine, for the person depending on it, for the work itself. Around 2 in the morning, Garrett said without looking up, "What do you do?" Dex said. "What I'm needed for." Garrett glanced at him. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one that covers all the cases." Garrett almost laughed. It came out as a short exhale through his nose, the closest approximation of a laugh he had managed in longer than he could clearly remember, and he was briefly surprised by it, by the fact that such a sound could still come out of him. Around 3, with the fork aligned and the oil system partially disassembled for inspection, Dex said, "Tell me how a man gets into a situation like yours." "With Harlow." Garrett was quiet for a moment, not because he was deciding whether to answer, but because he was organizing the answer into something that made sense when said out loud. "The way they all do it," he said. "Hospital sends the bill. You can't pay. It goes to collection. Collection sells it. And if someone's been watching for it, if someone's been tracking the property and the debt, and the person attached to both, they buy the collection debt at a fraction of what it's worth, and then they have a legal claim against you. Harlow's done it in this county before. 2 farms and a hardware store in the last 8 years." He set down a wrench and picked up a different one. "He's patient. That's what most people don't understand about men like that. They're not in a hurry. They don't need to pressure you. They just wait until you can't carry the weight anymore, and then they're standing right there when you go down." Dex said, "How much is the debt?" "Enough." "How much?" Garrett looked at him. 93,000. 60 of that was Nora's medical. The rest is compounded interest in legal fees over 2 years of Harlow's people sending letters." Dex did not say anything for a while. He turned the coffee cup in his hands, watching the steam. When he spoke, his voice was level and measured. "And there's nobody who can help. I've got a sister in Oregon. She's got her own life and her own expenses, and I'm not going to do that to her. My father would have said there's a right way and a wrong way to keep something, and keeping it by breaking someone else's the wrong way, even if the someone else's family." Dex was quiet again. Then he said softly, "Your father sounds like a man worth keeping in mind." Garrett set down the wrench. He looked at the photograph on the wall. Frank Briggs, 29 years old, standing in front of this building on the day it opened, squinting into the Arizona sun with the expression of a man who has just done something he was not entirely certain was possible, but went ahead and did it anyway, because the alternative was not doing it, and that was not acceptable to him. "Yeah," Garrett said. He was. The crack in the engine housing was the problem Garrett had been mentally preparing himself for since he first looked at the bike in the parking lot. It was real, and it was located in a place that meant no replacement part was going to come off any shelf in Garrett's existing inventory. He stood over it for several minutes, looking at it from different angles, thinking through his options, with the systematic patience his father had instilled in him. The understanding that the time spent thinking before you act is never wasted if you are thinking carefully. Then he went to the back room. The machining equipment Frank Briggs had acquired over 2 decades of careful buying was old, but maintained. A Bridgeport mill that had been in the shop since 1978. A metal lathe from 1982 that Garrett had rebuilt the headstock on 6 years ago and that ran as true as it ever had. The kind of equipment that serious shops used to have as a matter of course, and that most modern garages had given up on because it was easier and cheaper to outsource anything that complex. Garrett began setting up. Dex appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing making the part?" Dex stared at him. "You can do that." "My father could do it better," Garrett said. "But yes, I can do it." Dex was quiet for a moment. He looked at the equipment at Garrett's hands already moving through the familiar setup procedure, and then he said, "Garrett, that's going to take." "I know how long it's going to take," Garrett said. Another silence, longer and more considered. Then Dex said, "Why are you doing this?" Garrett looked over his shoulder at him. "Because Walt Pruitt rode a motorcycle 1,200 miles and almost made it. And because your name is Dex Calloway and you've got $52 and you're doing something for a dead man that costs you everything and benefits you nothing. And that means something to me." He turned back to the mill. "That's why." Dex stood in the doorway for a long moment. He said, "You don't know me." "I know enough," Garrett said. And the machine started up. It was past 4 in the morning when Dex said, "I ride with the Hells Angels." Garrett kept working. He said, "I know." Dex went still. "How?" "Your vest. I can see the bottom edge of the patch when your jacket shifts. I could see it when you first walked in." He kept his hands moving, his attention on the part taking shape under the cutting head. "I didn't say anything because I didn't want you to feel like you had to explain yourself or justify being here." He glanced up briefly. "Does it change something? Do you think I'm going to do something different now that you've said it out loud?" Dex said slowly, "Most people react differently." Garrett said, "My father had a rule. A man who needs help is a man who needs help. What he does when he doesn't need help, that's between him and whatever he answers to." He turned back to the machine. "You needed help. You got here. You're going to get to California." There was a long silence in the back room, the kind of silence that is not empty but full. The silence of two men settling into a mutual understanding that does not require further articulation. Then Dex said, "I've been writing for 40 years, keeping my word, looking after the people who earned it. In 40 years, I have met maybe 4 or 5 people who had what you've got." Garrett said, "What's that?" Dex said, "A spine that doesn't bend when it's supposed to." Garrett did not respond to that. He went back to the work, and Dex went back to the doorway, and the back room filled up with the sound of metal being shaped by careful hands, and the particular quality of quiet between two men who have decided they trust each other without having made any formal announcement about it. Walt Pruitt, Dex said at one point, speaking from the doorway while Garrett worked, was not a complicated man. He had grown up in eastern New Mexico. The son of a rancher, had gone into the Army at 18 and come back at 21 with a seriousness that had not been there before, and a way of looking at people that suggested he had seen enough of the worst things humans were capable of that the ordinary difficulties of civilian life seemed very small by comparison. He had never talked much about what he had seen. He had simply come home and gotten on with the business of building a life, which he had done with the same direct pragmatism he applied to everything. He had found the club in his late 20s. Dex said the way some men find the thing they were looking for without knowing they were looking for it. Not for the reputation, not for the identity, but for the specific quality of brotherhood that exists in communities bound by a code. Walt had understood codes. He had understood that a man without a code was a man without direction, and direction was the thing that kept a person moving forward when everything else was telling him to stop. Walt had let Dex sleep on his couch for 3 months in 1987 When Dex had lost his job and could not make rent, had not mentioned it again afterward, had not treated it as a debt owed or a favor to be repaid, had simply said when Dex had tried to thank him properly later that a man who can help should help and there is nothing more to say about it. Garrett listened to all of this without stopping work. He filed the information away with the same careful attention he gave to everything he thought might matter later. Walt Pruitt was not a complicated man, but he was the kind of man the world worked better with in it, and the world was going to be measurably lesser without him in ways that most people would never track or name because they would not know to look for his particular absence. By the time the part was finished and tested and installed, the sky outside the bay door had gone from black to deep blue to the preliminary gray that comes before actual light. The tools were cleaned and returned to their places. The fluids were topped. The fork alignment had been verified twice. Garrett torqued the final bolt on the housing and stood back and looked at what he had done. He looked at Dex. He nodded once. Dex sat forward on the stool. She ready to fire her up. Dex crossed to the bike and threw his leg over and settled his weight and kicked the starter. The Harley-Davidson came to life, and what Garrett heard in that moment was not the sound of an engine starting. It was the sound of something that had been broken becoming whole again. Full-throated and clean and powerful, no hesitation in it, no coughing or struggling, just the deep, certain voice of a machine that had been properly cared for and was ready for whatever road was ahead of it. The sound filled the shop and poured out through the open bay door and went up into the morning air like a statement. Garrett felt something in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. Not joy exactly, something quieter than joy and more durable. The particular satisfaction of a man doing what he was made for and doing it well, and the thing he made being whole because of it. Dex let the engine run for a moment, his head slightly tilted, listening with the attention of a man who knows what he is listening for. Then he throttled back and looked at Garrett, and there was something in his face that was more than gratitude, something that Garrett could not fully name but recognized as genuine, in the way you recognize things that are not performed. Garrett, Dex said. Garrett shook his head. I know what you're going to say. I want to. That bike gets Walt Pruitt to the Pacific Ocean, Garrett said. That's the payment. That's enough. Dex looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his vest pocket and placed the $52 on the workbench. He laid his hand flat on top of the bills for a second, a brief and deliberate gesture, the kind that carries meaning without requiring explanation. He said, I'm going to remember this place. Garrett said, it won't be here much longer. Dex said, maybe it will. And then he rode out of the bay and onto Route 66, heading west with Walt Pruitt in his pocket, in the morning light building ahead of him, and Garrett stood in the open doorway and watched him go. He watched until the sound of the engine was fully absorbed by the distance, and the road was empty in both directions, and the quiet came back, the particular quiet of a place that has just been full of something and is now waiting for whatever comes next. Garrett stood there for a while. He stood there longer than was probably necessary, looking at the empty road, thinking about 1,200 miles, and a man who never made it to California in life and was going to get there anyway, and about the kind of friend who would carry him that far without being asked twice. Then he went inside. He walked back to the center of the shop and looked at his father's tools on their pegboard and his father's photograph on the wall and the $52 on the workbench and the oil stains on the concrete floor that mapped everything that had ever been repaired here. He looked at the machining room doorway and at the equipment still warm from the night's work. He looked at all of it with the eyes of a man who is memorizing something he knows he is about to lose. He sat down on the floor with his back against the base of his father's workbench, the way he had sat there as a boy when Frank was working late, and Garrett did not want to go upstairs, but also did not want to be in the way. The concrete was cool through his jeans. The shop smelled of fresh oil and metal shavings, and the older smell underneath everything, the smell that had been in this building his entire life. He pressed his palms flat against his knees. He closed his eyes. And for the first time in 3 days, Garrett Briggs slept. He had 4 hours until Grant Harlow's lawyers arrived. He did not know it yet, but somewhere out on Route 66, heading west through the early Arizona morning, a man named Dex Calloway had already pulled over to the side of the road. He was sitting on Walt Pruitt's Harley in the growing light with his phone to his ear. He was talking to someone he had not talked to this early in the morning in years. He was talking without stopping, which was something he almost never did, and the man on the other end of the line was listening very carefully because Dex almost never did that either. And everything that was about to happen was already in motion, set in motion by two words said in the middle of the night, and the world was already answering in the way it answers when someone does the right thing without asking what they'll get for it. Garrett woke up on the concrete floor with a cramp in his left shoulder, in motor oil still under his fingernails, and the specific disorientation of a man who fell asleep somewhere he did not intend to. For 3 full seconds, he did not know what day it was. Then it came back the way hard things always come back, not gradually, but all at once, the whole weight of it landing without warning. Nora, the debt, Harlow, 9 o'clock. He looked at his watch, 7:42. He sat up slowly and breathed. The shop was quiet around him. The bay door was still open from when Dex had ridden out, and the morning air coming through was already warm, the way Arizona mornings get warm fast without transition, as if the desert does not believe in the gradual movement between states. Outside Route 66 was empty in both directions. The road looked the same as it always looked at this hour, patient and indifferent, carrying no record of what had happened on it the night before. Garrett stood up. He went to the utility sink in the corner and washed his hands and his face, and looked at himself in the small mirror someone had mounted above the faucet years ago. He could not remember who had put it there. It had simply always been there, part of the accumulated furniture of the place, like the radio and the pegboard and the photograph of Frank on the wall. The man looking back at him was 48 years old and had been awake most of the night and had gray at his temples that had not been there 2 years ago. Lines around his eyes that Nora used to trace with her finger and called distinguished, which was the word she used when she meant something that time had made better rather than worse. He dried his hands on a shop rag. He went upstairs and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen and spent 40 minutes going over the numbers one final time. Not because he expected to find something different. He had gone over the numbers enough times in the past 2 years to know them thoroughly, every detail fixed and immovable. He went over them because he needed to be able to say that he had looked, that he had not simply surrendered without checking one last time whether there was anything he had missed. There was nothing he had missed. He put the pen down. He thought about calling Linda. She would pick up on the second ring the way she always did, and she would say his name in that particular way. She had the way that meant she already knew from the single syllable that something was wrong. And he would tell her what was happening, and she would cry and argue and offer things she could not actually afford to offer. And at the end of all of it, he would still be sitting at the same kitchen table with the same numbers on the same legal pad, except Linda would be carrying it too. He was not going to do that to her. Not today. He drank his coffee and looked out the window at the morning and thought about Dex Calloway somewhere out on the highway by now, putting miles between himself and Arizona, with Walt Pruitt tucked into his vest pocket and a machine running clean underneath him. That was something. In a morning that did not have much to offer in the way of consolation, that was a real and specific thing that had gone right, and Garrett held on to it the way you hold on to the few solid things when most of the ground under you is uncertain. He was still sitting at the table when he heard the shop phone ringing downstairs. The shop phone was the old landline his father had installed in 1987 and never replaced, a heavy plastic wall-mounted unit the color of putty with a curled cord that had been stretched beyond recovery, and a ring that was genuinely loud, the kind of ring designed for a noisy shop floor where you might not hear something subtle. Garrett had kept it because the number had been the same for 37 years, and half his regular customers still called it by memory without looking it up. He almost did not answer it. The last several calls on that line had all been from Harlow's legal team, the kind of calls that are technically polite and are actually warnings delivered in the measured tones of people who do this professionally and have long since stopped attaching any personal feeling to it. but he went downstairs and picked it up. Harrison's. The voice on the other end was male, older, direct without being rude, the voice of a man who had learned somewhere along the way that words had weight and that wasting them was a form of disrespect. There was no preliminary warmth in it, no social padding, just purpose. This Garrett Briggs, who's asking? My name is Marcus Vane. I'm calling because a man named Dex Calloway called me approximately 4 hours ago and talked for 20 minutes without stopping, which Dex almost never does. So I paid attention. Garrett was quiet for a moment. He said, Dex rode out of here around sunrise. I know, Marcus said. He called me from the road. He told me about the garage. He told me about your wife. He told me about the foreclosure and the man who's been buying your debts and the 9 o'clock meeting. A brief pause. He told me what you did for Walt's bike. Garrett said, I fixed a motorcycle. Marcus said, that's not what Dex told it. Garrett was not sure what to say to that, so he did not say anything. Marcus said, I want to ask you something and I need you to answer me straight. All right. The debt, $93,000. Is that the number? Something cold moved through Garrett's chest. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling of standing at an unexpected height and suddenly understanding the distance between where you are and the ground. He said, how do you know that number? Dex knows it. Dex told me. Is it accurate? Give or take. Yes. And Harlow, Grant Harlow, his firm is the one that's been accumulating the collection debt. His people are walking in the door at 9. Garrett looked at the clock on the shop wall. 8:19. He said, I've got 40 minutes. Marcus said, I need you to stall them. Garrett blinked. I'm sorry. Do not sign anything. The voice had shifted, still steady, but with something underneath it now, a different quality of seriousness, the kind that belongs to a man who has already made a decision and is in the process of executing it. Tell them your attorney is in transit. Tell them you need more time for documentation review. Tell them anything you need to tell them, but do not put your name on any document before I call you back. Can you do that? Garrett stood in his father's shop in the early morning quiet and looked at the tools on the pegboard and the photograph on the wall and the $52 still sitting on the workbench where Dex had left them. He said, who are you, Marcus? Marcus said, right now I'm a man who is going to call you back. That's who I am right now. Will you wait? Garrett looked at the photograph of Frank Briggs, 29 years old, squinting into the Arizona sun, looking like a man who had decided the road ahead was going to be hard and had chosen it anyway because the only alternative was not taking it. He said, I'll wait. He hung up. He stood very still for a moment, the way you stand when something has shifted and you have not yet determined in which direction. Then he went upstairs and put on a clean shirt. At 8:57, a black SUV turned into the lot. Garrett watched from the window. 2 men got out, both in suits, both carrying briefcases, moving with the unhurried confidence of people who do not encounter much resistance in their professional lives. Behind them, a second vehicle pulled in. Garrett recognized it. Grant Harlow's black Mercedes, the kind of car that costs as much as a modest house, and is intended to communicate that fact without appearing to try. Garrett had met Harlow once before 8 months ago, when Harlow had come in person for what he called a courtesy visit and offered to purchase the property outright for a number that was technically money, but was also a statement about how little Garrett's situation was worth to him. Garrett had told him the property was not for sale. Harlow had nodded pleasantly and said he completely understood and driven away. 3 weeks later, the legal pressure had doubled. Grant Harlow was 60 years old and had the appearance of a man who had decided at some earlier point in his life that projecting relaxation was itself a form of authority. Silver-haired trim, the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades in rooms where he held the advantage and had grown comfortable there. He smiled the way people smile in professional photographs, automatically the expression fully formed but not reaching anything behind it. Garrett met them at the door. Garrett, Harlow said, extending his hand, I appreciate you being available this morning. I know this process has been difficult. Garrett shook the hand because his father had taught him that you shake a man's hand regardless of what you think of him. It is a statement about who you are, not who he is. Come in, Garrett said. They came in. Harlow looked around the shop with the specific quality of attention that belongs to a man calculating what something is worth and how quickly it can be converted into something else. Not appreciating what was there, but auditing it. The taller of the two attorneys opened his briefcase and produced a folder, which he set on the workbench with the practiced efficiency of someone who has performed this particular action many times. Mr. Briggs, we have the transfer documentation prepared. It's fairly straightforward. The debt resolution, the property conveyance, the inventory clause. He aligned the folder squarely on the workbench surface. If you'd like to review before signing. My attorney is on his way, Garrett said. The attorney stopped. He looked at Garrett. He looked at Harlow. Your attorney. He was delayed. I'd like to wait until he arrives before I sign anything. That's my right. Harlow's smile did not disappear. It went still. The stillness of a body of water in the moment before something moves through it beneath the surface. Of course, he said pleasantly. We can wait a reasonable amount of time. How long are we talking? He said he was close. Harlow looked at his watch. It was a very expensive watch, the kind worn by men who want the time telling to communicate something beyond the time. We've blocked most of the morning, he said. The pleasantness of his tone did not quite conceal what the words actually were, which was a warning delivered with a smile. I appreciate your patience, Garrett said. He said it the way his father would have said it. Straight, without apology, without any retreat in it. Just a man in his own shop telling a visitor what he appreciated and meaning it as the boundary it was. Harlow's attorneys exchanged a glance that carried information between them without any words. Harlow himself did not react visibly. He put his hands in his pockets and walked slowly toward the far wall, toward the photograph of Frank Briggs that had hung there since Garrett was a child. He looked at it for a moment. Your father, he said. It was not really a question. Yes. He built a good business here. He built the best business I've ever known, Garrett said. The room went quiet in a particular way. Garrett's phone rang. He picked it up before the second ring. Harrison's. Marcus said, I need 15 more minutes. Can you give me 15? My attorney is asking for a short recess. He's gathering some documentation. Garrett was looking at Harlow while he said it. He kept his voice level and his face neutral. Take your time. He hung up. Harlow was watching him with the expression of a man who has started to notice that the morning is not proceeding according to his expectations. One of his attorneys leaned toward him and said something very quietly, and Harlow nodded once without taking his eyes off Garrett. Garrett, Harlow said, let me be direct with you. Please, whatever you're trying to arrange right now, whatever conversation is happening, I need you to understand that the legal position here is settled. The debt is documented. The claim is recorded. Even if you find someone willing to assist you, the timeline for contesting a foreclosure action in this state is measured in months, not hours. He paused. I'm not your enemy. I'm a businessman. And this morning is going to end the same way regardless of what phone calls are being made. Garrett looked at him steadily. He said, my father told me something when I was about 12 years old. He said, never assume the last chapter's been written until the book is closed. He paused. I didn't understand it then. I'm starting to understand it now. Harlow said nothing. Garrett set his phone face up on the workbench and waited. The 15 minutes that followed were the longest 15 minutes Garrett had experienced since the night in the hospital corridor when the doctor came walking toward him, and Garrett already knew from the way the man was moving what the news was going to be before a single word was said. He sat on his stool. He did not fidget. He did not make conversation. He breathed steadily, and he looked at the tools on the pegboard and the photograph on the wall and the morning light coming through the bay door, and he kept his hands quiet on his knees. Harlow's attorneys checked their phones. Harlow himself stood near the window with his hands still in his pockets, performing patience with the practiced ease of someone who has learned that appearing untroubled is its own form of pressure. At 9:31, Garrett's phone rang. Harrison's. Marcus said, Garrett, I need you to hear me very carefully. I'm listening. We have had 4 attorneys working since 4 this morning on your situation. 2 of them specialize in Arizona property and debt law. They have been going through Harlow's acquisition of your debt collection accounts, and they found something. A brief pause. Harlow's firm used a purchasing entity called Clearwater Holdings. It's registered in Delaware. It does not hold an Arizona state certificate for medical debt portfolio acquisition. There is a 2019 amendment to an existing statute ARS, Section 6702, that requires any out-of-state entity acquiring Arizona medical debt collections to hold a state-issued certificate. Clearwater Holdings does not have that certificate. Garrett sat very still. What does that mean, he said. In plain language, it means the legal basis for the foreclosure action may be built on a defective foundation. Harlow may not have the valid right to foreclose on your property, not because the debt doesn't exist, but because the method by which he acquired the right to act on it may be invalid under state law. The shop was completely quiet. Garrett became aware of Harlow watching him from across the room with the focused attention of a man who is trying to read a conversation he can only hear one side of. He said into the phone, "Are you certain? Certain enough that 2 attorneys are prepared to walk into that room and say it to Harlow's face? The question is whether I can get them there in time." Garrett looked at the clock. He looked at Harlow. He looked at the folder sitting on his father's workbench with his name printed on the cover. "How much time do you need?" 2 hours, maybe less. Harlow said from across the room, "Garrett, I think we've waited long enough." Garrett stood up from the stool. He said into the phone, "Come as fast as you can." Then he lowered the phone and looked at Grant Harlow across the shop floor that his father had built in 1971 on the belief that a man who could fix broken things was never truly useless. He said, "Mr. Harlow, I'm not signing anything today. My attorney has identified a potential legal irregularity in your debt acquisition that needs to be reviewed before any transfer can proceed. If you'd like to leave and return when that review is complete, I'm happy to set a time that works for everyone." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences that had come before it. Something had changed in the room. Harlow's smile did not disappear, but something behind it tightened the adjustment of a man whose plan has encountered an unexpected obstruction and who is working out his response while maintaining the appearance of someone for whom nothing unexpected ever happens. He said, "Garrett, I would encourage you to think very carefully." "I have thought carefully," Garrett said. "This is my father's shop. His name is on the sign. I am not signing it away on the basis of a debt acquisition that may not be legally valid." He held Harlow's gaze without looking away. "If I'm wrong, the courts will tell me I'm wrong, and I'll accept that. But I'm not wrong, and I think you know that." One of the attorneys grabbed the other's arm, said something very quickly and quietly. The second attorney's face changed in a way that was brief but visible. He picked up his briefcase and said, "Mr. Harlow, a word outside." Harlow looked at his attorney. He looked at Garrett. And for one unguarded moment, something moved across his face that was not the practiced relaxation or the automatic smile. Something that looked like a man who has been in the middle of a long and carefully constructed plan and has just heard a sound he was not expecting. He said, "We'll be in touch," and he walked out. Garrett stood in the center of his father's shop and listened to the sound of the Mercedes leaving the lot. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the specific physical aftermath of holding yourself completely still under enormous pressure for an extended period, which takes more out of a body than most people understand until they have done it. He sat down on the floor with his back against the base of his father's workbench. He pressed his palms flat against his knees. He breathed slowly until the shaking stopped. His phone rang. Marcus said, "What happened?" Garrett said, "They left." A pause, then Marcus said, "Good." And there was something in his voice that was not surprise, but was deeply satisfied. The satisfaction of a man who made a bet on someone and watched them come through exactly as expected. "The attorneys are on their way. 2 hours, Garrett. I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Don't open that door to anyone in a suit unless they've called ahead and given you a name I've confirmed. Can you do that? Yes. Garrett paused. Marcus, I need to ask you something. Ask. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. Dex met me for one night. You've spent money on attorneys, and you've been on the phone since before sunrise, and I don't understand what's in this for you. Marcus was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Still direct, but with something underneath it now that had not been there before. Something personal in a way the earlier conversation had not been. He said, 31 years ago, I was 22 years old and completely lost. Not lost like I didn't know which road to take. Lost like I didn't think the road mattered. A man I had never met before took me into his shop and spent 3 hours talking to me. No history between us, no obligation, no reason in the world to give me that time, except that he could see I needed something, and he had it to give. A pause. That man changed my life. I was never able to pay him back because he died 10 years ago, and you cannot pay back a dead man. Another pause. But sometimes you can pay it forward. And sometimes the situation is very direct about telling you when it's time. Garrett sat on the floor of his father's garage with his back against the workbench and the photograph of Frank Briggs on the wall above him. He did not say anything for a long moment because there was nothing adequate to say. He said, "Thank you, Marcus." "Hold the fort," Marcus said. "We're coming." The 2 hours Marcus had promised stretched into 2 hours and 40 minutes, and every one of those minutes had its own specific weight. Garrett spent them working. Not because there was a customer waiting, not because any job was scheduled or expected, but because his hands needed to be doing something or his mind would consume him whole. He reorganized the tool chest his father had built from scratch in 1973. He cleaned the machining equipment he had used through the night to fabricate the housing piece for Waltz Harley. He swept the concrete floor that did not need sweeping. He did all of it with the methodical patience Frank had spent 20 years trying to teach him, the understanding that work was not only about the product, it was about who you were while you were doing it. His phone sat face up on the workbench, silent. At 11:47 it rang. He had it before the first ring finished. Harrison's. A woman's voice. Clipped and precise, the voice of someone who had learned to be economical with words because she operated in environments where every word carried weight and nothing could be wasted. "Mr. Briggs, my name is Renata Solis. I'm one of the attorneys Marcus Vane retained. We're approximately 20 minutes out, and I need to brief you before we arrive." "Go ahead." "The irregularity is real, and it is significant. Clearwater Holdings is registered in Delaware and does not hold an Arizona certificate for medical debt portfolio acquisition. That is a violation of ARS Section 6702 subsection D as amended in 2019. What that means practically is that Harlow's right to act as a secured creditor against your property is built on a defective legal foundation." A brief pause. "The underlying debt is real. The hospital bills exist and they are owed. But Harlow's right to foreclose on real property based on those bills, that is what we are challenging." Garrett said, "What are the odds?" "In front of the right judge, very good. The statute is clear. The violation is documented. The question is timing. If Harlow moves quickly and gets before a judge before we establish our position, he could argue the procedural challenge comes too late." Her voice sharpened. "You have not signed anything. Nothing. Keep it that way. We're almost there." She hung up. Garrett set the phone down and looked at Frank's photograph on the wall. He looked at it for a long moment, at the young man squinting into the Arizona sun on the day this building first opened its doors, at the particular expression of someone who has just done something they were not certain they could do. He said out loud to the photograph, to the empty shop, to whatever part of his father might still be present in the smell of the concrete and the organization of the tools, "You would have liked this morning, Dad. It's been something." He heard the cars pull into the lot 2 minutes later. Renata Solis was in her early 50s, sharp-eyed and purposeful, with the bearing of a woman who had spent decades working in rooms where people underestimated her and had long since made her peace with that being their problem rather than hers. With her were two younger attorneys, a man named Davis, who wore thick frame glasses and moved with the focused energy of someone who had been awake since 4 in the morning on something that genuinely mattered to him, and a second woman who said little but missed nothing. They moved into the shop with coordinated efficiency. Renata shook Garrett's hand. Garrett Briggs. Not a question. Renata Solis. She was already moving toward the workbench, already opening her document case. Here is where we are. I filed a preliminary injunction with Maricopa County 40 minutes ago, challenging the validity of the foreclosure action based on the statutory violation. That filing creates a legal hold. Harlow cannot complete the transfer while the injunction is pending judicial review. Garrett stared at her. You filed it already. From the car, on the way here. She looked at him steadily. A judge will review it this afternoon. In the meantime, the hold is in effect. A pause. This buys time, Garrett. It may do considerably more than that. I believe it will. But what it definitively does right now is buy time. Do you understand? Yes. Good. Then I need everything. Bank correspondence, original debt notices, every communication from Harlow's firm, the purchase history on the property, all of it. She nodded once and they got to work. For 2 hours, the workbench where Garrett had fabricated a motorcycle part the night before was covered in documents instead of tools. Renata and her colleagues moved through the paperwork with focused precision, flagging and annotating, and building a legal structure that Garrett could only partially follow, but trusted because Renata's confidence was not the perform kind. It came from solid ground, from knowing exactly what she was standing on and why. At one point, Davis held up a letter and his expression changed in a way that was small but significant. This communication from Harlow's office, February of last year. He held it out to Renata. He's referencing the debt as fully secured against real property. That language, given that Clearwater Holdings isn't a valid creditor, means he was making a materially false claim in writing to a property owner. That's potentially. Renata looked at the letter. Her expression shifted by a fraction, precise and controlled and significant. Yes, she said. Davis said, is it as significant as I think it is? Renata said, it is more significant than you think it is. Garrett said, can someone translate that for me? Renata looked at him. It means Harlow may have crossed a line that takes this beyond a civil property dispute into territory that interests the state attorney general's office. Written misrepresentation intended to induce a property owner to concede rights he would not otherwise concede. She set the letter down carefully. It doesn't change today's immediate fight, but it changes the landscape considerably. Garrett looked at Harlow's signature at the bottom of the letter. Neat and authoritative, the signature of a man who expected it to carry permanent weight. He said quietly, he thought he had this finished. Renata said, he did have it finished, until someone decided not to sign and made a phone call. She looked at Garrett directly. Marcus told me what happened, what you did for that rider last night. Garrett said, I fixed a motorcycle. Renata almost smiled. It was brief and genuine. That's what he said you'd say? Garrett's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered it. Harrison's. Harlow's voice. Smooth still, but something underneath it different from the morning. More careful. The voice of a man who has begun recalibrating his position. Garrett, I understand an injunction was filed this morning. That's right. A pause. I think we should talk. Just the two of us without the attorneys making everything complicated. Man to man. Garrett said, my attorney has advised me not to have conversations without her present. A longer pause. I see. Then more carefully. Garrett, I want you to understand that I have relationships in this county going back 20 years. Judges, bankers, city council members. I'm not saying that as a threat. I'm offering context. Garrett said, I appreciate the context, Mr. Harlow. He paused. My attorney is very good at her job. I think we'll let the process work. He hung up. Renata was watching him. Harlow. Yes. What did he say? He mentioned his relationships with judges and bankers, said it wasn't a threat. Renata said it was a threat. I know, Garrett said. I've met men like him before. They're most dangerous right before they realize they've lost. He looked at her steadily. Have we lost? Renata said not today. It was shortly after 2 in the afternoon when Garrett first heard it. He was in the middle of signing an affidavit at the workbench pen, moving across the bottom of the page, when something stopped him. Not a sound exactly. Not yet. A vibration. Something that entered the body before the ears could process it, a low frequency that Garrett felt in his sternum and the soles of his feet standing on the concrete floor. The kind of thing you notice before you know what you are noticing. He set the pen down. Davis looked at him. Everything okay? Garrett said, do you hear that? Davis listened. His expression was uncertain. Garrett walked to the bay door. The sound was growing now, moving from felt to heard, acquiring shape and dimension. He recognized it before his conscious mind had named it. The layered roar of many engines running together at road speed felt first in the chest and only then processed by the ears. Not one or two, not a handful. Many. Building the way a river builds when tributaries are feeding into it from every direction, each one adding to a total that keeps growing beyond what you expected. He stepped out into the lot. He looked west on Route 66. The horizon was moving. What had been a dark line at the limit of his vision resolved itself as it approached into individual shapes, and the shapes became riders, 2 and 3 abreast, filling the highway from shoulder to shoulder with the unhurried precision of a formation that knew exactly what it was doing. Above them, the sound built until it was not something Garrett heard so much as something he existed inside of a total environment, pressing against the walls of his chest and resonating in his back teeth and coming up through the asphalt, through the soles of his boots. He stood completely still. He did not reach for his phone. He did not speak. He stood in front of his father's garage on a Tuesday afternoon and watched 112 motorcycles come riding out of the Arizona distance toward him, and he felt something happening in him that he did not have a name for and did not try to name. Renata had come to stand beside him. Garrett, she said quietly, who are these people? Garrett watched the first riders pull into the lot, slowing, making space, the formation beginning to sort itself with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this before. Then they came one after another, bikes turning in, with the calm discipline of a community that moves together because it has chosen to and knows how. He said, friends, I think. They filled the lot completely. They lined the road in front of the garage and pulled into the field across the highway, and the sound of 112 engines shutting down one by one was its own kind of music, a long diminishing that took nearly a full minute, each silence revealing more silences beneath it, until the lot was full of people, and the quiet that replaced the sound was enormous, in the way that only enormous sounds can leave enormous quiet behind them. 2 men walked toward Garrett out of that quiet. One of them was Dex Calloway. Dex looked exactly as he had when he rode away at sunrise. The gray beard, the layered vest, the deliberate economy of his movement. Except something in his face was different now. Not relief and not satisfaction, but something more complicated than either of those, the expression of a man who made a promise he was not entirely certain he could keep and then kept it. The man beside Dex was taller, probably 60, built like someone who had spent decades doing physical work and had not stopped. He had a face that had earned every line on it and eyes that assessed everything they looked at without appearing to be assessing anything. He wore a cut that identified him clearly, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who does not need to announce what he is because it is already apparent to anyone paying attention. Dex said Garrett. Garrett said Dex. He looked at the lot full of riders at the road lined with motorcycles, in the field across the highway where Moore had pulled over. You came back. Dex said, I made it as far as Needles. He almost smiled. Couldn't keep going. The taller man extended his hand. Marcus Vane. Garrett shook it. The grip was firm and brief, the handshake of a man who means it as a statement rather than a formality. I appreciate the call this morning, Garrett said. Marcus said, I appreciate you holding the line. He looked around the shop, taking it in the way people who truly pay attention take things in, registering not just what was there, but what it represented, the accumulated weight of it. Your father built this. Yes, Marcus nodded slowly. Good bones, he said. Good history. He looked at Garrett directly. We need to talk about what comes next. They went inside. Garrett, Marcus, Dex, and Renata. The others stayed in the lot. And the particular thing about 112 people choosing to stand quietly outside a building is that it has a gravity to it, a presence, a statement made without a single word being spoken that is louder than most things said with words. Renata spread her documents on the workbench and looked at Marcus with characteristic directness. The injunction creates a legal hold, but the underlying debt is real, $93,000. Contesting the foreclosure method buys time and will likely force Harlow to restructure his position, but it does not make the debt disappear. At some point, that number has to be addressed. Marcus said, what's the deadline for addressing it while the injunction holds? If the judge affirms the injunction this afternoon, which I believe he will, we likely have 72 hours before Harlow's attorneys file a countermotion. If we can retire the underlying debt within that window, the foreclosure claim dissolves entirely. There is nothing left for it to stand on. Marcus looked at Garrett. Is there anything you want to say before I say what I'm about to say? Garrett said, I don't take charity. Marcus said, good, because I'm not offering any. He reached into his vest and produced a document folded but clearly prepared with proper headings and formatting, not something drafted hastily, but something thought through in advance. He set it on the workbench. What I'm offering is a business arrangement, the kind where you keep your shop, keep your name on the sign, keep full operational control. In exchange, we retire the debt as a structured loan to the business, repayable over time at terms that are fair to both sides. Harrison's becomes an official service and rest point for our network when riders are moving through the Southwest. He paused. You do the work. You run it the way you've always run it. We bring volume and resources. We don't tell you how to do your job because we don't know how to do your job. That's why we need you. Garrett looked at the document. He looked at Marcus. He looked at Dex, who was standing to the side watching with the patient stillness of a man who has laid something on a table and is letting the other person take whatever time they need. He said, why you could find other shops, cleaner balance sheets, better equipment. Marcus said we could. He said it without argument, the way you state a plain fact. But we found this one, and we found it because of what you did last night. And what you did last night tells me something about who you are that I cannot find in a shop with better equipment and a cleaner balance sheet. He paused. You fixed a dead man's motorcycle in the middle of the night for free on what you believed was the last night you'd own this place. You didn't do it to be seen. You didn't do it because you thought anything was coming back to you. You did it because it was right. Another pause. I want to do business with a man like that. Those men are rare, rarer than people think. The shop was very quiet around all of them. Garrett looked at his father's photograph. He thought about Frank Briggs building this floor and pouring this concrete and putting up that sign and believing in something specific enough to stake 30 years of his life on it. He thought about Nora sitting in the chair in the corner through 20 years of the garage, asking real questions, tracing the lines around his eyes, saying this road was their journey. He picked up the document and read it carefully. Renata moved beside him and read it with him, making small notations with her pen, asking Marcus 2 precise questions that Marcus answered without defensiveness or impatience. Garrett watched that exchange and saw the way Marcus responded to Renata's sharpness, with respect rather than irritation, and it told him something important about the kind of man he was dealing with. He read to the end. He set it down. He said, there's a clause about the sign. Marcus said, yes. It says the name stays. Harrison's Auto and Cycles. It stays. That is not negotiable on our end. That is a condition of the arrangement, not a concession. Marcus looked at him directly. Your father's name belongs on that building. We are not here to replace that. We are here because of it. Something moved through Garrett's face that he did not try to control or contain. It was brief and it was real, and Marcus saw it and said nothing, because some moments do not require commentary, and the people who understand that are worth knowing. Garrett said, I need to make one call. Take your time. He stepped away from the workbench and called his sister in Oregon. Linda picked up on the second ring the way she always did. He said, Linda, something's happening. I need 5 minutes. He told her. Not everything there was, not time for everything, but enough. Dex, Marcus, the document, the debt, the riders in the lot. He could hear her breathing change as he talked, then crying quietly the way Linda had always cried without taking up much space with it, as if she did not want the crying to cost anyone anything. She said, Garrett, is it real? Is this actually happening? He said, I think it is. She said Dad would have, and she could not finish it. He said, I know, Linda, I know. She said, say yes, Garrett, please say yes. He said, yeah. His voice came out rough at the edges. Yeah, I think I'm going to. He hung up and turned back to the workbench. Marcus was waiting. Dex was waiting. Renata was watching him with something in her expression that had moved beyond professional into something more plainly human. Outside the sound of an engine, Harlow's Mercedes appeared at the entrance of the lot and stopped. Through the windshield, Garrett could see Harlow looking at the lot, at the filled bays, at the 112 riders standing in the property he had spent 2 years engineering a way to take. He sat very still for a long moment. One of his attorneys said something. Harlow responded, and then slowly the Mercedes reversed out of the lot and drove away. No one cheered. No one said anything. The riders just watched the car go, and the watching was its own kind of statement. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Garrett had heard in years. Marcus said quietly, he'll try again through his attorneys. He doesn't give up that easily. Garrett said, I know. He looked at the document on the workbench. But he's going to have to try a lot harder. He picked up Renata's pen. His hand was steady. He signed. The moment the pen came down outside, a sound rose from the lot. Not wild, not shouted, deep and full and genuine from the chests of 112 people who had ridden a long way for something they believed in and had just been told it came through. Garrett stood in the middle of his father's shop in the middle of that sound. He breathed. He let it move through him the way his father had taught him to let the hard moments come, without flinching, without looking away, without trying to make them smaller than they were. Then Renata's phone rang. She listened. Her face changed. She looked at Garrett across the workbench and said, Harlow's attorneys have filed an emergency countermotion. They're challenging the injunction on procedural grounds and requesting an emergency hearing before close of business today. She paused. If the judge grants the hearing and Harlow's argument holds, everything we have done today gets unwound before morning. The shop went very quiet again. Garrett looked at Renata. Do you believe in the case? She said without hesitation, completely. Then go. She went. The door swung behind her. Her car left the lot. And the waiting began again, the specific violence of waiting. When the thing you love most in the world is in a room you are not allowed to enter, being argued over by people whose job is to argue, and all you can do is stay present and hold yourself together and trust the person you sent in your place. Marcus put his hand on Garrett's shoulder. Once, brief, he said, your father built something worth fighting for. Garrett looked at the photograph on the wall. Yes, he said, he did. The waiting was its own kind of violence, and Garrett had learned over the years that there were different kinds. He had waited in hospital corridors with bad coffee going cold in his hands, while doctors used words like aggressive and options in voices calibrated to sound calm when the information they were delivering was not calm at all. He had waited at his father's bedside through a long night 11 years ago, holding a hand that was cooling hour by hour, while the machines registered the slow arithmetic of a life concluding. He knew the particular texture of waiting when the outcome is beyond your control and all you can do is stay present and not fall apart. This waiting was different because there was still a chance. And hope Garrett had learned through hard experience makes waiting harder rather than easier. Despair is a kind of settled weather. You know what it is, and you dress for it, and you move through it. Hope is a live wire. It does not let you settle. It keeps every nerve alert and every second elongated, and the mind running the same calculations over and over without arriving at any new result. He did not sit down. He moved around the shop slowly, not with any purpose, just moving the way animals move when they are confined and can feel something large approaching. He checked the alignment of tools that did not need checking. He wiped down a surface that was already clean. He stood at the bay door and looked out at the lot where 112 riders had arranged themselves into something between a vigil and a statement, sitting and standing, with the particular patience of people who came a long way for something and are prepared to remain until it resolves one way or another. Someone had brought food from somewhere. Garrett could smell it, something warm and substantial, and there was the low, steady murmur of conversation and the occasional flare of a lighter and the sound of people who know how to wait because their communities have always required it of them, and they have learned that waiting together is different from waiting alone. Marcus sat on the stool near the workbench, drinking water from a bottle one of the riders had brought in, watching Garrett with the calm steadiness of a man who has learned that other people's anxiety is not something you fix. You stay close to it and you let the person know they are not alone in it, and you do not make it worse by performing a comfort you do not actually feel. Dex had gone outside to be with the others, but had come back in twice to check on Garrett. Each time he had said very little. Each time that had been exactly right. At 3:15, Renata called. Garrett had the phone before the ring finished. "Renata!" Her voice was controlled but carrying weight the way a cable sounds different when significant load is on it. The judge agreed to hear the emergency motion. "We're in chambers now. Informal hearing, both sides present." A pause. "Harlow has David Keller arguing for him." Garrett said, "Is that bad?" "Keller is very good." "Are you better?" A half beat of silence. Then yes. No qualification, no hedging, just the word standing on its own, carrying its own weight. "But I need you to understand what Keller is arguing. He's not contesting the statutory violation directly. He's arguing that the injunction was improperly filed because the challenging party failed to exhaust administrative remedies before seeking judicial intervention. It's a technical argument. It doesn't address whether Harlow did something wrong. It addresses whether we went to the right place first to say so. Is he right? He's not wrong, but he's not right enough." Another pause shorter. The judge is asking questions, good questions. That's either very good or very bad, depending on which direction his thinking is running, and I can't tell you which yet. Garrett said, "What do you need from me?" "Nothing right now. I wanted you to know where we are." Her voice shifted by a fraction, just enough to be heard by someone paying attention. "Garrett, I have argued 40-some injunction cases in this state. I know what I'm doing in that room." "I know you do. I'll call the moment I have anything." She was gone. Garrett set the phone down. He looked at Marcus, who looked back at him and said nothing. Dex had come back inside during the call and now stood near the doorway reading Garrett's face with the patient attention of a man who has learned to extract information from what people do not say as much as from what they do. Dex said, "What did she say?" Garrett told him. Dex listened without interrupting. When Garrett finished, Dex said, "Keller. He said the name the way you say the name of someone you have encountered before in circumstances you did not enjoy and have not forgotten. He argued a property case in Flagstaff 3 years ago. Other side from us. He wins on procedure more than substance. When the substance is against him, procedure is all he has," Marcus said without looking up from the water bottle. "And the substance is against him." Dex said, "Yes." Garrett said, "Then we wait." Marcus said, "We wait." Garrett sat down on the floor. Not the stool, not a chair, the floor. With his back against the base of his father's workbench, because the stool felt too provisional, too much like perching on the edge of something uncertain, and the floor was solid. The floor was concrete. Frank Briggs had mixed and poured in the summer of 1971 with his own hands coming back from Korea with the specific need to build something that would outlast what the war had taken from him, and it had held 50 years of weight without shifting, and it would hold his. He pressed his palms flat on his knees. He breathed. Marcus said after a while, "Tell me about your wife." It was an unexpected question, and it was offered without the careful framing people usually put around such things, without the "I hope you don't mind" or the "you don't have to answer that." Just a direct question from a direct man who wanted to know because he thought knowing mattered. Garrett said Nora. Marcus said Nora. Garrett said, "We met when I was 24. She came in with a 1978 Sportster that needed a complete overhaul, her grandfather's bike. She'd inherited it, and she knew nothing about motorcycles, and she knew nothing, which made her different from most people who come in not knowing anything." He paused, looking at nothing in particular, but seeing something very specific. "She sat in that chair in the corner for 3 hours while I worked and asked questions the whole time. Not polite questions, real ones. What does that do? Why does it work that way? What happens if you get that wrong?" He looked at the corner where the chair still sat worn down to the wood on one armrest, from years of people resting their elbows on it while they waited and watched. "I fell in love with her before the bike was finished." Marcus said, "How long were you married?" 22 years. Garrett was quiet for a moment. "She used to say that living on Route 66 meant you were always watching other people's journeys and never going on your own. I told her this was our journey. She said I was right." A pause. "She said it the way she said things when she thought I was a little bit wrong but didn't want to make an issue of it. I've thought about that a lot since she passed. I think she might have wanted more road than she got." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She watched you build something real. She watched you keep something worth keeping. That's a kind of road too. Not every journey moves." Garrett said, "Yeah." He looked at his father's photograph on the wall. "Yeah, she did." Outside, the low constant presence of 112 people waiting had its own kind of sound even in its quietness. The occasional voice, the shift of weight on gravel, the sense of something gathered and held in place by shared purpose. Garrett was aware of it the way you are aware of something that is holding you up without your having asked it, to a presence you did not arrange for and cannot quite account for, and are grateful for in a way that goes beyond what words are adequately built to carry. The phone rang at 4:48. Garrett was on his feet before the second ring. He answered without looking at the screen. Renata. Her voice was different. He could not immediately read it. The control was still there, but something else was in it now. Something she was not quite containing. Something pressing against the professional surface from the inside. She said, "The judge has ruled." Everything in him went absolutely still. He said, "Tell me." She said, "The injunction stands." The air went out of him all at once. Not a collapse, a release. The way a pressure valve sounds when something that has been held too long is finally allowed to move. He put his free hand flat on the workbench to steady himself on the surface where $52 still sat, and where he had fabricated a motorcycle part the night before, and where he had signed a document an hour ago that he now understood the full weight of. He said, "Say that again." She said, "The injunction stands." Judge Harmon rejected Keller's procedural challenge on the grounds that the statutory violation constitutes sufficient basis for expedited judicial intervention, regardless of administrative remedy status. Her voice had warmth in it now. Real warmth, the kind that surfaces in controlled people when they finally allow it. In plain language, he agreed that what Harlow did was wrong enough that you did not have to work through every bureaucratic channel before asking a court to stop it. The foreclosure action is suspended pending full review. Harlow cannot touch this property while that review is pending. Garrett said, "How long is the review?" "Months minimum. And given the February letter, the written misrepresentation Davis identified, I have already been in contact with the State Attorney General's office. They are interested, very interested." A pause. "Garrett, I don't want to get ahead of the process, but the direction this is moving suggests that Harlow may have considerably larger problems to address than your garage." Garrett said, Renata. Yes. Thank you, I mean that completely. She said, thank Marcus. He got the attorneys there in time. A brief pause. And thank yourself for not signing this morning. That was the moment everything else became possible. Everything. She hung up. Garrett stood with the phone in his hand. He turned to Marcus and Dex, both of whom were on their feet, both reading his face with the focused attention of men who have been waiting for a single piece of information and know it has just arrived. He said the injunction stands. Dex said Garrett, just his name, nothing after it, nothing needed after it. Marcus stepped forward and put both hands on Garrett's shoulders. Not the brief professional grip from before, something genuine and deliberate. The way a man holds another man when something real has passed between them and the moment calls for acknowledgement that words alone are not sufficient for. He said, your father's shop is still your father's shop. Garrett nodded, several times quickly, which was the only response he could manage and was enough. Marcus went to the bay door and stepped out into the lot. He did not make a speech. He simply said clearly to the riders assembled there, the injunction stands, the garage is secure. The sound that rose was not a cheer exactly. It was deeper than a cheer and more durable. It came from the chest rather than the throat, the sound of people who came because something mattered to them and have just been told it went the right way, visceral and collective and completely genuine. It filled the lot and went up into the late afternoon air and carried out over Route 66 in both directions, and Garrett, standing in the bay door behind Marcus, felt it move through him like a current passing through something that has been waiting a long time to conduct it. He thought Nora would have loved this. He thought, Dad, you would not believe this day. He stood there and let himself feel all of it. The relief and the grief and the gratitude and the exhaustion and the strange luminous quality of a moment that you know while you are inside, it is one you will carry for the rest of your life. He had been keeping things separate and manageable for 24 hours, compartmentalizing with the discipline his father had modeled, and that life had refined in him, and now he let them come together because a man can only hold things apart for so long before the holding itself becomes its own kind of damage. He did not cry, but it was close and he did not try to prevent it from being close. Dex appeared beside him. He said, you okay? Garrett said, I'm getting there. Dex said, you know what Walt would have said about today? Garrett said, I didn't know Walt. Dex said, Walt used to say that the universe keeps a ledger. Not like religion, not like karma exactly, just like an actual ledger. Credits and debits. And the ledger balances. Maybe not on your schedule, maybe not in the form you expected, but it balances. He paused. Last night you put something in the ledger. Today you collected. Garrett said, that's a simple way to see it. Dex said Walt was a simple man. That's why he was wise. They stood together in the bay door for a while, looking out at the lot full of riders in the late afternoon light, and Garrett thought that this was the strangest and most remarkable day of his adult life, and that tomorrow it would begin to seem real, and that right now it still had the quality of something experienced rather than something he could yet fully claim as his own. At 5:20, Grant Harlow called. Garrett almost did not answer. Then he did because his father had taught him that you do not avoid conversations with people you have beaten fairly. That is not grace, Frank had said. That is contempt wearing Grace's clothing, and the two are not the same thing. Harrison's. Harlow's voice had changed. The professional surface was still there, the smoothness still present, but something beneath it was fundamentally different from the morning. The absolute confidence was gone. In its place was something more careful and more calculating. The sound of a man reassessing his position from a place he had not expected to occupy and working out what comes next. Garrett, he said, I owe you a direct conversation. Garrett waited. I underestimated you. I want to say that plainly. A pause. I have been in this business for 20 years. I know how these situations go. People in your position, financial pressure, personal loss time running against them, they sign. Not because they want to, but because they cannot see another way. Another pause. You found another way. Garrett said, I had help. Harlow said, the filing about the February correspondence, your attorney's work. I'm not going to discuss my legal strategy with you. No, of course not. A silence with weight in it, the weight of a man arriving at something. Garrett, I want to be honest with you because I think we are past the point where anything else is useful. My legal team has advised me that the Attorney General contact, if it proceeds, creates exposure that goes significantly beyond this property dispute. Garrett said, I'd suggest you speak with your attorneys. Harlow said, I have been. The pause that followed had the specific quality of a man arriving at a decision he had not planned to arrive at when he woke up that morning. I would like to discuss a resolution, a real one, not a pressured one. The debt of full release of any claim against the property and a settlement figure for the misrepresentation issue that reflects the actual impact on you rather than the legal maximum exposure. He said it carefully with the precision of a man who has spent his career structuring arrangements in his own favor and is now for what may be the first time structuring one in someone else's. Garrett stood in the middle of his father's shop. He thought about what Frank would have said. Frank would have said, do not negotiate when you are emotional and do not walk away from something real when you see it clearly in front of you. He said, have your attorneys contact Renata Solis. If the terms are real, she will tell me. Harlow said, that's fair. A pause and then something that came out quietly in a different register than anything that had preceded it in their dealings. Something that sounded like a man who has looked at himself honestly and found the view instructive. You would have been within your rights to come at me as hard as the law allows. Garrett said, I know. Harlow said, why didn't you? Garrett thought about it for a moment, not performing the thinking, but actually doing it, actually sitting with the question. He said, because I'm not trying to destroy anyone, I'm trying to keep my father's garage. A pause. Those are two different things. Harlow said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, yes, they are. And he hung up. Garrett set the phone down. He looked at Marcus, who had clearly heard enough of the conversation to follow its shape and meaning. Marcus raised his eyebrows slightly. Garrett said, he wants to settle. Marcus said, do you trust it? Garrett said, I trust Renata to tell me whether to trust it. Marcus nodded slowly. Good answer. He stood up from the stool. Garrett, there are 112 people outside who rode a long way today and are going to need somewhere to be tonight. Garrett said, Henderson's motel is 8 miles east. Tell them Garrett Briggs sent them, and Donna Henderson will take care of them. He paused. And the diner next to it, Lou Abernethy's place. Tell Lou the same. He has been feeding travelers on this road for 30 years. He will know what to do. Marcus said, that's a lot of people. Lou and Donna have both been bringing vehicles to this garage since before I was born. They will be glad for the business, and they will be glad for the reason. Garrett looked at Marcus. This town takes care of people who come here in good faith. That is what this road means, or it used to. Marcus said it still does. He put his hand out and Garrett shook it. The partnership is real. The document is signed. Give yourself time to let it settle before we get into the operational details. There's no rush on any of that. He paused. Garrett, you don't owe me anything. You did something last night that cost you nothing to give and gave everything. The least I could do was make sure it didn't also cost you your father's business. Garrett said Walt Pruitt. Marcus said Walt would have loved today. He would have told the story for years. Something moved in his face, brief and real. Walt told every story for years. Drove us all half crazy. He almost smiled. We would give anything to hear him tell one more. Outside, Marcus moved through the riders with the natural authority of a man whose people trust him completely, organizing and directing the 112 toward the road in the long amber light of late afternoon. Dex appeared in the bay door one more time. He looked at Garrett. Garrett looked back at him. This man he had met 18 hours ago. The stranger who had arrived with $52 and a broken motorcycle and had set in motion the most extraordinary day of Garrett's adult life, without calculation, without agenda, simply by telling the truth to someone who would listen and act on what they heard. Dex said, "Walt is still waiting. California is still waiting." Garrett nodded. He looked at Dex for a moment longer. Then he said, "When I get to the Pacific, when I scatter Walt's ashes." "Yeah. I'll tell him a mechanic on Route 66 says hello." Garrett looked at him. Something moved in his chest that was too large and too complicated to address directly in the time they had, and both of them understood that without either of them saying so, which was its own kind of communication. He said, "You do that." Dex walked to Walt Pruitt's Harley. He put on his helmet. He settled his weight on the bike the way a man settles onto something he has ridden 10,000 miles and trusts completely. He kicked the starter and the engine came to life exactly the way Garrett had built it, to come to life clean and full, inserting the voice of a machine that has been properly cared for and is ready for whatever road is ahead of it. He rode out of the lot. Garrett watched him go, and this time the sound of the engine did not disappear into silence. It merged with the sound of the other riders pulling out one by one back onto Route 66 in their various directions, the enormous collective sound of 112 engines building and then slowly spreading across the desert as they dispersed each one, taking a piece of the sound with it until finally there was one engine and then none. Garrett stood alone in the lot in the quiet that follows enormous sound, which is its own particular kind of silence. The silence of something that was full and is now empty in a way that does not feel like loss so much as completion. He looked up at the sign. Harrison's Auto and Cycle. Two dead letters. The A in auto and the second S in cycles dark against the lit ones, the small ongoing damage he had been meaning to address for 3 years and had not addressed because first Nora was sick and then Nora was gone. And then the garage was going to be taken, and fixing a sign felt like the kind of thing you do when life still has the shape of a future. He stood there looking at it for a long moment. Then he went inside. He walked to the back room and found his father's old extension ladder aluminum, the kind Frank had bought in 1979, and maintained with the same thoroughness he maintained everything he owned. He carried it out to the front of the building and set it up against the wall. Then he went back inside to the shelf in the back room where the box of replacement bulbs had been sitting for 3 years, ordered and received and set aside during the week. Nora's diagnosis came back, and everything that had seemed important before that phone call was reclassified into things that could wait indefinitely. He took the box off the shelf. He climbed the ladder. The evening was warm and the light was going amber, the way it goes amber in Arizona, in the hour before dark, hitting everything from the side, so that the shadows are long and the colors are saturated, and the whole desert landscape looks like a painting of itself. Route 66 was quiet in both directions. The riders gone, the road returned to its ordinary patience. Behind him, the garage was solid and whole, the sounds of it settling in the cooling air, the particular language of a building that has been here a long time and intends to remain. Garrett replaced the first bulb, then the second. He climbed down. He stepped back. He looked up. Harrison's Auto and Cycles. All the letters. Every one. Lit fully evenly the name his father had put up in 1971 on the belief that a man who could fix broken things was never truly useless complete again for the first time in 3 years. Garrett stood in the empty lot in the fading evening light and looked at his father's name on the building his father had built and let himself have the moment entirely. Not managing it, not containing it, not being appropriate about it. Just a man standing in front of something his father built, watching it be whole again, feeling the weight that had been on his chest for 14 months begin slowly and imperfectly, but genuinely to lift. His phone buzzed. A text from Renata. Harlow's attorney called. "Terms are real. We'll talk tomorrow. Tonight you should rest." He read it twice. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at the sign one more time the way you look at something you have been afraid of losing and have not yet fully accepted that you still have. Then he went inside. He walked upstairs to the kitchen and made himself a proper meal for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember. eggs and toast and coffee that he actually tasted rather than simply consumed the first cup he had made since Nora died, that he was present enough to notice was good. He sat at the table where he and Nora had eaten 1,000 meals together, the table where Frank had eaten when he came up from the shop on cold evenings, the table that had been the center of this particular life for more years than Garrett had been alive. He ate slowly. He let the day settle into him the way a long, hard thing settles when it has finally concluded all the pieces of it, finding their places in the larger story of who you are and what your life has been and what it is going to be from here. Outside Route 66 was quiet. Somewhere to the west, Dex Calloway was riding toward California with Walt Pruitt in his pocket and a machine under him that ran the way it was supposed to run. And Garrett Briggs was still here in his father's place, with his father's name on the sign above the door, and tomorrow arriving the way tomorrow always arrives, without fanfare, without guarantees, but arriving. The settlement took 11 days. Renata negotiated with the precision and patience of someone who has learned that the best agreements are the ones where both sides finish believing the process was fair, even when it was not equal. Harlow's attorneys pushed back twice on the misrepresentation clause. Renata held firm both times without raising her voice, without theatrics, without any of the performance that substitutes for substance in lawyers who have less of it. On the 11th day, Harlow signed. The debt was retired. The foreclosure action was permanently withdrawn. The property claim was released in full, recorded with the county, and filed with the same court that had granted the injunction. Garrett sat in Renata's office when she called with the final confirmation. He listened to her read the key language from the filing. When she finished, he said, "It's over." She said, "It's over." He said, "The garage is mine." She said, "The garage is yours. Clean title, no encumbrances, no pending claims." A pause. Garrett, in 23 years of practice, I have never had a case move this fast in this direction. What you did for that rider on the night before the hearing, I don't know how to quantify that in legal terms, but I know it is the reason all of us were in that room. He thanked her. He hung up. He sat in his truck in the parking lot outside her building for 10 minutes before he drove anywhere because he needed the 10 minutes to let what had just happened become real in his body rather than just in his mind. He said it out loud once to no one just to hear how it sounded in the air of the cab. "The garage is mine." Then he drove home. The first thing he did when he got back to the shop was call Linda. She answered on the second ring. He said, "It's done." She made a sound that was not a word. The sound of relief held back long enough that it has lost its language, pure and unstructured and completely recognizable to anyone who has ever felt it themselves. He let her have it. He waited. When she could speak again, she said, "Garrett promised me something." He said, "What?" She said, "Promise me you'll fix the coffee machine." He laughed. It came out full and genuine and slightly surprised, the laugh of a man who has been too close to the edge of things for too long and has found himself suddenly on solid ground and does not quite know yet how to stand on it without bracing. He said, "The coffee machine is fine. The coffee is just bad." Linda said, "The coffee has been bad for 20 years. Dad's coffee was bad too. It's hereditary." She was crying and laughing at the same time, the way she had always been able to do, which had always impressed Garrett because he could not manage both at once. He had tried once and ended up just confused. "I'm coming to visit," she said. "Next month. I'm putting it in my calendar right now while we're on the phone so I can't talk myself out of it." Garrett said, "I'll fix the coffee machine." Linda said, "Don't you dare." He spent the rest of that day doing the work. Not the paperwork, not the business planning, not the administrative reality that was going to need attention in the coming weeks. Just the actual work. The reason the shop existed. The reason Frank had built it. A 1994 Silverado with a transmission that had been complaining for months. A Honda Shadow whose carburetor needed cleaning. Small jobs, careful work hands that knew what they were doing, applied to problems that had clear solutions. By evening, the Silverado was running smooth, and the Shadow was tuned, and Garrett was covered in grease and genuinely tired, in the good way that comes from using your body for what it was built for. He stood at the utility sink and washed his hands and looked at himself in the small mirror. The same face from 11 days ago, but something different in it now. Not younger, not repaired in any simple way. Present. The eyes of a man who has come back from somewhere difficult and is still orienting to the fact that he made it, that the ground under him is solid and his own and going to remain so. 3 weeks after the settlement, Marcus drove out from Flagstaff. Not with 100 riders, just Marcus in a truck with a man named Cal Dempsey, who turned out to be a contractor who had rebuilt 3 facilities for the club's network and who knew how to preserve the bones of a historical structure while modernizing what needed modernizing. Marcus and Garrett walked through the shop together. Marcus mostly listened while Garrett talked about what Frank had built and what had been added over the years and what had been let go for lack of money and what he had always meant to do but had not been able to. Marcus asked questions that were specific and practical and demonstrated that he had been thinking carefully about this before he arrived. Cal walked the building systematically, making notes, asking Garrett questions about load-bearing walls and electrical capacity in the original foundation. At one point, Cal crouched down and put his palm flat on the concrete floor, the way someone puts a hand on something they want to understand through contact rather than inspection alone. He said, "Who poured this?" Garrett said, "My father. 1971. Cal said, "This is better concrete than most things built in the 90s. He stood up slowly, looking at the floor with the particular appreciation of a craftsman recognizing another craftsman's work across 50 years of time and weather. "What did he do before the garage?" Garrett said, "Korea, and before that, construction." Cal nodded slowly. "Your father knew what he was doing." Garrett said, "Yes, he did." The renovation plan that emerged over the following 2 weeks was careful and right, in the specific way that plans are right when the people making them have listened before they proposed. New lifts, updated electrical to support modern diagnostic equipment while preserving the analog tools Garrett had always preferred for the information they gave through touch and sound and experience. A proper waiting area that felt like a room people wanted to be in rather than a space designed to contain them. And in the back, the machining room fully equipped and documented what Garrett could do with his hands, made teachable, made transferable, made into something that could outlast any single person's working life. That last part mattered most to Garrett, and Marcus had understood it without being told, which itself told Garrett something. The sign stayed. No new signage, no branding overlay, no additional identifiers. Just Harrison's Auto and Cycles, all letters lit the way Frank had first lit it in 1971, and the way it would be lit from now on. The first day the shop reopened after the renovation, Garrett arrived at 6 in the morning to find 3 motorcycles already waiting outside. Riders from a Chapter 2 states over word having traveled through the network with the velocity that information moves through communities that actually communicate with each other. They needed a full service check before a long road. Garrett said, "Pull them inside." They were on the road by 10:30. By noon, 2 more riders had come in. A trucker brought an old Ford that had been losing power on the grade east of town. A retired couple in a camper van asked about a generator problem that 3 other shops had failed to diagnose. Garrett found it in 40 minutes. The couple sat in the waiting room and drank the coffee and said it was the best coffee they had had on the entire trip. Garrett did not tell them about the 11 days or the injunction or the 112 riders or any of it. He fixed their generator and charged them a fair price and watched them drive back out onto Route 66 heading west, and he felt the particular satisfaction of a man whose life has come back into alignment with what he was built for. 6 weeks after the reopening, Garrett hired his first employee. Owen Marsh was 23 years old and had grown up in the town and had been fixing things since he was old enough to reach an engine. He had applied for the job with a handwritten letter that Garrett read 3 times before he put it down. Specific, honest, no inflation, no performed enthusiasm, just a clear account of what he knew and what he wanted to learn and why he believed this was the place to learn it. Frank Briggs would have respected that letter. Garrett hired him on a Tuesday and put him to work on a Wednesday, and by Thursday, Garrett knew he had made the right call because Owen had the thing. You cannot teach the thing that either lives in a person or does not. The instinct for what was wrong, the patience to find it, the refusal to guess when you could know. Garrett taught him the way Frank had taught Garrett. Not explanation first, demonstration, hands on the problem, questions answered when they were asked and not before. He taught him the machining room. He taught him that a diagnostic computer tells you what the computer can measure and nothing beyond that, and that everything else lives in your hands and your ears and the accumulated knowledge of everyone who has ever worked in a place like this, encoded in the concrete floor, and the organized tools and the photograph of a man on the wall who knew how to build something that lasts. By the end of the second month, Garrett had hired 2 more mechanics, both young and local, and worth the investment. The garage that had been running on one man's stubbornness and grief was becoming something again, a place with a future, with a succession, with the capacity to carry the name forward beyond the span of any single man's working life. Frank had built it to last. Garrett was making sure it would. It was on a Tuesday afternoon in early summer, approximately 8 months after the night Dex Calloway pushed a broken Harley through the bay door that Garrett was under a 1968 Mustang, doing brake work when he heard them. He heard them the way he had heard them that afternoon in the lot, not with his ears first, but with his body, a vibration that entered through the concrete floor and came up through his back and settled in his sternum before his mind had fully processed what it was. He slid out from under the car and sat up. Owen was at the workbench and looked over at him. "You okay?" Garrett said. "Listen." Owen listened. His face changed as the sound reached him, moving from sensation to recognition, his expression shifting the way expressions shift when something that was unfamiliar becomes understood. Garrett stood. He walked to the bay door. He looked out at Route 66. Fewer than before, maybe 30. But they came the same way, with the same deliberate formation, the same unhurried discipline of people who move together because they have chosen to, and who do not need to perform the choosing for anyone's benefit. At the front, riding the same position he had held 8 months ago, on a night that had changed everything, was Dex Calloway. They pulled in. Engines went quiet one by one. Dex dismounted. Garrett walked out to meet him. They looked at each other across the short distance of the lot, and everything between them was different now from that first look across a dark parking lot. Everything was known. Everything had been established by what had passed between them on the night and the day that followed it. "Dex," said Garrett. Garrett said Dex. He looked at the riders behind him, at Marcus Vane among them, at faces he recognized and faces he did not. "You made it." Dex said Walt made it to the Pacific. A pause, and in the pause, something that was grief and satisfaction, together the complicated mixture of feelings that belongs to missions completed at great cost. "It was a good day. I scattered the ashes at sunset." He almost smiled, which was Walt's kind of timing. He always had a flair for the dramatic. Garrett said, "What did you say when you scattered them?" Dex said, "I told him about the mechanic on Route 66 who said hello." He looked at Garrett steadily. "He would have liked you. He likes stubborn men with good hands." Garrett said, "I'll take that." Marcus came forward and shook Garrett's hand and looked at the shop, the sign fully lit, the new equipment visible through the bay window, the vehicles in the lot, Owen and the 2 other young mechanics visible through the glass, all of them working with the focused efficiency of people who have been taught well. Marcus said, "Garrett, look at this place." Garrett looked at it. He had been looking at it every day for 8 months. But he looked at it now through Marcus's eyes, the building that had been on the edge of being lost and was now full of work and purpose and the particular sound of people doing what they were good at. He said, "We've been busy." Marcus said, "I can see that." He shook Garrett's hand. "The arrangement working for you," Garrett said, "better than I expected, and I expected it to work." Marcus nodded. "That's the right answer." They brought the bikes in, all 30, mostly for the once-over before long roads. The assurance that everything tight was tight and everything that should move moved freely. Garrett and Owen and the 2 other mechanics worked through the afternoon with quiet efficiency, moving from bike to bike, and the riders sat in the waiting area and drank the good coffee and talked among themselves with the easy, low conversation of people comfortable in the spaces between destinations. At some point in the afternoon, a young rider, 25 at most, with the particular alert quality of someone still finding his place in a community he has recently joined, came and stood in the bay door and watched Garrett work. Garrett noticed him after a few minutes and looked up. The young man said, "Sorry, Dex told me about this place, about what happened here." A pause. "About what you did?" Garrett said, "I fixed a motorcycle." The young man looked at him. "That's what Dex said you'd say." Garrett looked back at the bike in front of him. He turned a wrench. Then he said, "What's your name?" The young man said, "Britton." Garrett said, "Britton, come here." Britton stepped into the bay with the careful alertness of someone who has been invited into a space that matters and understands that it does. Garrett looked at him. The young face, the attentiveness, the quality of someone who wants to learn something and is not quite sure yet how to ask for it. Garrett said, "Put your hand on the engine casing. Right here." Britton put his hand where Garrett indicated with the careful uncertainty of someone performing an action whose purpose they do not yet understand. Garrett said, "What do you feel?" Britton frowned, concentrating with visible effort. "It's warm, and there's a kind of vibration, uneven maybe." Garrett said, "That's a timing issue, minor but real. If he rode another 300 miles without catching it, it would have become something considerably less minor." He looked at Britton. "Most people would have missed it. Most machines don't tell you in words. You have to know how to listen." Britton said, "How do you learn to listen like that?" Garrett said, "You work. You pay attention. You don't guess when you can know." He paused. "And you find someone willing to show you, which is harder than it sounds and worth more than most people understand until they have it." Britton stayed in the bay for the rest of the afternoon watching, asking questions. When Garrett nodded that a question was welcome, learning to be still when stillness was what the work required. Learning that some forms of knowledge come through the hands and not through words, and that the only way to acquire them is to be present and patient and willing to not know something until you genuinely do. Garrett thought about Owen, who had stood in the same doorway with a handwritten letter and a willingness to be taught. He thought about himself at 20, watching Frank's hands move over an engine with the certainty of someone who had done this 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more. He thought about Frank in 1971 building this floor and pouring it true because he needed to build something that would outlast the things the war had taken from him. The lineage of it, the way a thing passes forward when the people who carry it take the responsibility seriously enough to give it to someone else who will carry it further. Near closing time, Dex found Garrett at the utility sink. He said, "We're heading out in the morning. I wanted to say something before it gets loud." Garrett dried his hands. He turned and looked at Dex. Dex said, 8 months ago, I pushed a broken bike into a shop that was hours from being shuttered, and a man who had nothing left to give gave me everything he had." Garrett said, "Dex." Dex said, "I know you're about to tell me again that you just fixed a motorcycle." Something in his eyes was very carefully controlled, the control of a man keeping a lid on something real. "Let me finish." Garrett said, "All right." Dex said, "I have been riding since I was 19 years old. I have put close to 500,000 miles on the roads of this country. I have met every kind of person there is to meet on a highway." He paused, and in the pause gathered something that had been with him a long time. "What you did that night is the reason people still believe that strangers can be good to each other, that it's not naive to extend yourself for someone you don't know, that the accounting of this life is not purely transactional." He stopped. He looked at Garrett directly without looking away. Walt believed that. He lived by it for 72 years. I think he wanted his ashes scattered somewhere that proved it was still true. Garrett stood very still. He let Dex finish. Then he said, "Dex, I need you to hear me." "Go ahead." "That night when I told you to push it inside, I was not being noble. I was not thinking about legacy or kindness or what my father would have wanted. I was standing in my shop on the last night I thought I would own it, and a man showed up who needed help, and not helping him would have required me to be someone I am not. He paused. That is all it was. I am not a saint. I am a mechanic. I acted like one. Dex looked at him for a long moment. He said, Garrett, a pause that carried everything in it. That is exactly what a saint would say. Garrett laughed, full and genuine and slightly surprised the way laughter comes back to a person when the weight has finally lifted enough to make room for it. Outside, the evening light was hitting Route 66 at the angle that makes the highway look like something out of a photograph, that specific amber quality the desert produces in the hour before dark, when everything is lit from the side, and the shadows are long, and the road ahead looks like it could carry you anywhere you needed to go. Garrett walked out to the lot. He stood under the sign. He looked up at it the way he had been looking up at it since the evening he climbed the ladder and replaced the two dead letters. Not because it needed checking, but because he was still not done being grateful for it. And he thought he might not be done for a long time yet, and that was all right. Harrison's Auto and Cycles, all the letters, every one. His father's name fully lit the way Frank had intended it when he first switched it on in 1971 and watched it come to life on a road that went somewhere even when you didn't know where. Owen came out of the bay behind him and stood nearby, one of the other mechanics. Britton, who had stayed close all afternoon and was still watching and still learning. Marcus Vane, who had driven out from Flagstaff on a Tuesday because a man he had never met needed what only he was positioned to provide. Dex Calloway, who had turned around in Needles and come back because he could not keep going without doing something first. Garrett thought about Nora, who had sat in that chair through 20 years of the garage and called this road their journey. He thought about Frank, who built this floor in 1971 and poured it true because he came back from a war and needed to build something that would last. He thought about Walt Pruitt, whose ashes were in the Pacific Ocean now scattered at sunset, which was Walt's kind of timing. He thought about two words said in the middle of the night to a stranger with $52 and a broken motorcycle and a dead man's ashes in his pocket. Two words that had cost nothing to say. Two words that had come back to him 8 months later, compounded in ways he could not have predicted and would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of. He breathed the evening air. He felt the lot around him, the people in it, the building behind him, the road in front of him, stretching west toward a coast where Walt Pruitt had finally arrived. He felt the weight that had been on his chest for 14 months, the weight of grief and debt and the fear of losing the last thing that connected him to everyone he had loved, and he felt it lift. Finally and completely and without reservation. Not because the grief was gone, grief does not go, but because the thing the grief had been threatening to take with it was still here, still standing, still lit. Garrett Briggs was still here. His father's name was on the sign. The shop was alive. The road went on, and on Route 66 on an evening in early summer with the light going amber and the engines warming for the road, and the whole long American highway stretching west toward the ocean, that was enough. That was everything. That was the only answer to the only question that had ever actually mattered. Kindness is not a strategy. It is not a transaction. It is not a calculation about what might return to you someday in a form you can spend. It is simpler than that and harder than that. It is the decision made in one specific moment on one specific night by one specific man standing in a doorway who looked at a stranger in trouble and said two words. Garrett Briggs opened a bay door on the last night he thought he would own anything. He did not do it for what it would bring back to him. He did it because it was right and because his father had taught him that a man who can fix something broken is never truly useless, and because somewhere in the accumulated wisdom of 50 years of oil-stained concrete and tools hung in their proper places, he already knew that the right thing and the hard thing are usually the same thing, and that doing it anyway is the only answer that has ever mattered. The whole world came riding back through that door. That is how it works. That is how it has always worked.